As a current theology master student at Baylor University, I'm going to be explaining who actually wrote the New Testament. See, before I used to think that the New Testament just magically fell from the sky into this and was this perfect leather-bound manual that we get to read in our everyday Bibles. But the truth is actually just way messier. See, most of it was written because the early church was just on fire, and not in the good sense. It was divided, persecuted, chaotic, and someone had to speak before the movement completely collapsed. And so, in a modern sense, the New Testament was actually the church's first group chat crisis. You either know what I'm saying or you don't, turned into scripture. So let me tell you the moment where this became very real for me. I was reading the New Testament like a textbook, looking for these, timeless principles. And then I realized these weren't actually written in a classroom. They were written in hospitals, prisons, living rooms where churches were trying to survive. And so you know that feeling when you're leading people and everyone is hitting you with all of these questions and you're like, well, if I don't answer this correctly, this could really cause some division. That's the New Testament world. So here's the key. Here's how we understand how we got the New Testament that we see today. You have to think about two processes. Number one, how these texts were written, which is composition. And number two, how the church recognized these texts as central or canon. Okay? So both of these happen as pastoral response to real problems. We're going to see more of these problems in this conversation. So ultimately, they didn't have a manual. So think of it like this. Think of the Bible like the church's manual or handbook for identity and mission. But the first Christians didn't have a New Testament yet. They inherited Israel's scriptures, or what we call as the Old Testament. But everything got ultimately recentered around Jesus, because the Jewish believers reread their scriptures through the Messiah, and Gentile believers were connected to Israel's scriptures because they were connected to Jesus. So the early church needed something urgent. It needed reliable apostolic teaching, it needed true stories about Jesus, and it needed guidance for how to live. And so here were the real questions that created the New Testament. I would encourage you to write these down if you have a pen and paper, or maybe notes on your iPhone. A, who is Jesus really? Why does he deserve my loyalty? B, how do we live now? What do we do with money, ambition, sex, power, forgiveness? C, how can a crucified Messiah be good news? Because this is actually really interesting. In the ancient world, crucifixion wasn't just like any other death. It was public shame. It was quite literally the worst possible way to die. And so Christians at this time had to look at that and explain, well, how can God's chosen one be executed like a criminal and still be God's victory, God's chosen one? D, are we really God's people? Are we heirs of the promise? E, how do we worship and do community life? How do we gather? What practices mark us? F, when will Jesus return? How do we stay faithful in a world that looks unchanged? G, who's legit and who's lying? How do we spot deceivers? How do we know when someone is telling us the truth? So we come across two big relationship issues or crises. The first of these is the relationship to Israel and the Torah. So do Gentiles have to become Jews first? What's the role of Torah in the new covenant people? And if Jesus fulfills Israel's hope, why do so many reject him? This is basically early Christian identity formation. So they're not inventing a new God. They're claiming the God of Israel has acted decisively in Jesus. The second crisis that we see is the relationship to Greco-Roman society. See, Gentile converts at this time had to abandon their idols. But idolatry, super interesting. Idolatry wasn't a religion. It was their social life. And they saw this in family events, in business events, or even civic festivals as well. Idolatry was a whole way of living. And so refusing rituals looked like impiety, or basically like you were saying, I hate society. So imagine being a new believer and realizing following Jesus is going to cost you your friends, your job, your reputation, and maybe even your life. This was very, very serious to make the decision at this time to follow Jesus. And so here's the plot twist that we see. The Gospels are also pastoral. Here's what happened with my reading of the Gospels. And ultimately, here's what changed my view on my reading of the Gospels. I realized that they're not just biographies, they're also pastoral tools. They preserve Jesus' traditions in what speaks to real debates in real churches. So when you read them, you're not just watching Jesus, you're also watching the early church learn how to apply Jesus to all of the mess that they were in. And so here's the formation of a New Testament. First, we see that the New Covenant language was pretty early. So Christians use this New Covenant language pretty early on. And it comes straight from Jeremiah, where God is promising a covenant that changes hearts. And Hebrews even uses that to explain Jesus' death and ascension as covenant ratification. So even the Last Supper tradition also connects Jesus' death to the New Covenant. We also see why these written texts became so urgent as well. Because at first, apostolic voice was living. It was preaching. It was teaching. It was practical stuff. It was living. But as apostles and eyewitnesses began to die off, access wasn't as guaranteed anymore. And so written text became that anchor. And so the canon didn't just serve or begin as a library project. It began as a survival project. Again, everything we're saying, keep in mind, they are living this. They are writing these New Testament texts that we see now in a very lived, chaotic experience where, again, I said in the beginning, the church is on fire and not in a good way. But here's the problem that we see. Once these writings began to spread, not everything sounded like the apostles. Again, the apostles are starting to die off. They're not really in the scene anymore. And so these written texts are starting to circulate and be spread, but they're not sounding so much like the apostles. Some texts claimed authority, but carried a totally different Jesus. And then some try to shrink the whole faith down to one set of texts. And so the church had to decide what voice actually connects us back to Jesus and what voice slowly pulls us away. This is how the church ultimately recognized the canon. This wasn't one meeting where bishops came together with a checklist. It was a long, organic, and largely consensual process. Churches ultimately kept returning to certain texts because they answered the church's core questions so well. And so in a timeline order, I'm going to list out the evidence that we see of this and of everything that I'm talking about. See, first we see that Paul's letters began to circulate pretty early. And when I say circulate, that means they began to be spread and read among different people. They began to be just pushed out to the public. And so churches ultimately shared them more. Next, we see that the Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, spread widely enough that later Gospel writers could use earlier ones as well. We also have evidence that John was being read far away by the early 2nd century. And by the late 2nd century, people are treating the 4 Gospels as a unified witness. And lastly, church leaders are quoting these texts pretty regularly and constantly, even if they don't always call them scripture yet. So, you can see that the church uses 3 big instincts. Number 1, apostolicity. That's a tough word to say. Does this match the apostolic faith? Is it from an apostle or tied to apostolic witness? Number 2, antiquity. Is it from the earliest generation close to Jesus? And number 3, Catholicity. Is it used broadly across churches? Does it nourish the church everywhere, not just one niche group? See, canon didn't create authority. Canon recognized authority that communities already were living under. So, who decided what counts? Like, who decided the books that are going to count for the New Testament that we see today? In the most important sense, the church didn't invent the New Testament. Okay, we need to understand that. The church only recognized the sets of texts that continually pulled them back to 3 things. It connected them back to 3 things. Number 1, the apostolic witness. Number 2, the teachings of Jesus. And number 3, the center of the gospel. So the New Testament is ultimately the church staying connected, not to trends, not to charismatic personalities, not to new spiritual fads, but to Jesus as witnessed by the apostles. I'm going to say that again. The New Testament is the church staying connected, not to trends, not to these charismatic personalities, but to Jesus as witnessed by the apostles. And so it's not just a book of answers, it's the record of a community on how to stay faithful and learning themselves how to stay faithful when everything around them is pressuring them not to. And so we're going to close with this. If you've ever felt just overwhelmed by questions, or you've felt like the Christian life is just a little bit too messy and just too much for you, you're not behind. You're reading the same kind of world that these New Testament, or you're reading the same kind of world that the New Testament was born from. And this is ultimately why I love to study the Bible deeper. It doesn't make scripture colder. It makes it more human. It gives it even just a more miraculous feeling. Because ultimately, as we just saw in these past couple of minutes, we have a very real God who meets people in their real problems. And so here's what I want you to do. The next time you open a New Testament book, I want you to first ask yourself this. What problem is the text trying to pastor? That one question is going to quite literally change your reading overnight. We'll catch you on the next one.